All right, hello everyone. So we are going to get started. My name is Kelsey. I'm a coordinator on the Community Education and Outreach team at Samaritans. I'll be leading us through this webinar today about how we can support those at risk for suicide. The first thing I want to do is I want to talk a little bit more about Samaritans and the programs and services that we offer. At Samaritans, we have three branches of services. The first branch that you see there is a prevention service, and it's what you're hearing at this moment. We give webinars, we give in-person trainings all over Massachusetts. We go to schools, organizations, nonprofits, for-profits, really anywhere that's willing to start that conversation about suicide prevention, we're willing to go there and talk to them. Our biggest branch of service, I think the one that people most likely know us for, is our intervention branch. And that's what we call our crisis services. What this really boils down to is our 24/7 helpline. I'll post a number at the end, but for right now, I want to give you a little more information about that. So that number, you can call or text it 24/7. So any hour of the day, any day of the week, including holidays, there is always someone there to talk to you. On that helpline, we get about 80,000 calls and texts every year. So if you average that out, it's about 200 on any given day. So of course, with that many calls, we are of course talking to people every day who have thoughts of suicide. But we're also talking to people that they aren't feeling suicidal, but it's 3 a.m. and they have a big test or presentation the next morning. And they're really anxious, they can't sleep, they just need to talk to someone to calm down. Or they're going through a separation with a partner and they've lost that support system and they don't feel like they have someone to talk to. So, as I mentioned, of course, every day we are talking to people who have thoughts of suicide, but I think something that a lot of people don't realize is that you don't have to have thoughts of suicide to call us. You can call us for anything that is hard, stressful, that you just need a listening ear for. So the way our helpline operates, is we are run by volunteers. The volunteers go through extensive training to learn how to talk to someone in a crisis, how they can be the most supportive possible. They go through in-class training, some shadowing shifts, and continued education. What happens when a person calls or texts our helpline? The very first thing is that volunteer will greet them and share their name, and they'll ask if the caller would like to share their name, but it's not a requirement. So sometimes people will tell us, I'm not that comfortable having this conversation if you know my name. I'd rather stay anonymous. Perfectly fine. Whatever makes that conversation easier for our caller, we're here to have that with them. So it's confidential, it's anonymous, and it's a free service. The third branch and final branch of our services at Samaritans is our post-pension services. This is what we call our grief support services. We have support groups and one-on-one meetings for people that we call loss survivors. Loss survivors are individuals who have lost a loved one to suicide. So the support groups are all loss survivors led by loss survivors. The one-on-one meetings are between two loss survivors. And it's really to help them through that grief. Because what we know is that losing a loved one to suicide, the grief plays out a lot differently than losing a loved one in a different way. We know that it's a unique grief, that they need that support of people who understand what they're going through. What I want to do before we jump in a little bit further is start that conversation about suicide prevention with some facts and figures. I want to preface it by saying that sometimes when we talk about facts and figures, it paints an issue as black and white. And what we know about suicide and suicide prevention is it's of course not black and white. I may go through this whole webinar and talk about risk factors, warning signs, and you might have a loved one who has lost their life to suicide or who has struggled with those thoughts themselves. And you may think, none of this rings true. None of this makes sense. Or you might go through and see the risk factors and think, wow, I have a loved one who checks off all these boxes, but they've never had thoughts of suicide. I think that's perfectly understandable. I think we need to take every case in an individual case-by-case basis. It won't all look the same. But I think what facts and figures does, and what this presentation does, is it gives you a lay of the land of what happens often in suicide and suicide prevention. And it's telling us pretty clearly we have a public health crisis going on in our country. So the first number that I want to draw your attention to is that number in the top left-hand corner, the 47,173. This is the number of people who have died by suicide in the United States in the year 2017. So we're a few years off, but it's the most recent data. That's a pretty big number. And unfortunately, that number is probably higher than what we have on the screen there. So the 47,173 number means the amount of recorded deaths by suicide. And there's some issues with looking just at the recorded deaths because the way that the CDC collects information on deaths is they put it in one single category. So for example, something like a single car crash or an overdose could be accidental, could be a suicide, but unless the CDC has specific criteria that suggests without any questioning that it was a suicide, they won't put it in that category. So unfortunately, that number is probably higher than the one we're seeing at the screen at this time. It also is one of the only causes of death that continues to rise. We're getting much better at things like making cars safer, curing certain diseases. We're not getting that much better at suicide prevention. The good news is that here in Massachusetts, we are doing pretty well in comparison to the rest of the country. We had 638 deaths by suicide in the year 2017. I believe we are 47th or 48th out of the 50 states, so pretty low in our amount of suicides. Of course, still too high and something we're working on. We are also substantially lower in our rates in suicide than some of our close New England neighbors, such as Maine, New Hampshire. And sometimes that feels kind of weird. Like, why are we so close geographically, yet states like Maine and New Hampshire have much, much higher rates of suicide than we do? I think there's a lot of factors to be considered in this. One of them is isolation. Even in our more rural areas of Massachusetts, we're less isolated than states such as Maine. We also have more resources to go around, and we have better health care in comparison to a lot of our neighbors. We have higher coverage, not enough again, but of course, higher than some other places. The last factor, though, that I want to talk about, because I don't think it gets enough conversation in the field, is gun legislation. So research shows that the stricter a state's gun legislation, the lower their rates of suicide. And that's not to say that owning a firearm makes someone suicidal, but it is a very lethal method. It's hard for us to intercept if someone chooses to use a firearm in their plan for suicide. And we have much stricter gun legislation than our neighbors like New Hampshire and Maine. The other two statistics I want to talk about are on the right-hand side here. The one in the middle says the highest suicide rate is among adults aged 45 to 64, particularly white males. What this statistic is saying is that of all the deaths by suicide that are reported, the biggest chunk, the biggest population, is adult men aged 45 to 64, particularly white males. However, again, we have to think a little bit more critically, as we discussed in that 47,000 number, about what about the deaths that aren't being reported? For multiple reasons, sometimes families choose not to report their loved one's death as a suicide. And as we mentioned before, we need um, we need to fully know that it's a suicide for the CDC to mark it as such. So I also think it's important to look within different populations. For example, the LGBTQ population, proportionally within that population, people are dying at extremely high rates. Recently, the New York Times also released an article about how young Black males are dying by suicide at skyrocketing rates. So their rates are just climbing and climbing in a way that no other demographic is. I think it's important to be aware of this statistic that we have here and to know that it exists, but also to recognize that suicide touches every single community. It's happening at alarming rates all over and plays out differently within different communities. So trying to learn within our own community what it looks like and how we can prevent it. Lastly, the statistic at the bottom says men die by suicide 3.5 times more than women, though women attempt suicide more often. I think what this really comes down to is we live in a society where we say things like, boys don't cry, or man up. We don't teach our young boys or our men to reach out when they're struggling for that help. And because of this and multiple other factors, men are more likely to lean on lethal means, such as firearms and hangings, while females, are more likely to lean on what we call interceptable means in the field. That's things like poisoning, pills, things that we have more of a chance to intervene in and potentially save their life. So the next thing I want to do is I have a few true or false questions. What I'm going to do is I will read out the statements, and I want you to just take a few seconds, not too long, to think, do you believe this statement is true, false, and I'll also add somewhere in between. So true, false, or somewhere in between. Talking about suicide will cause someone to consider suicide. Take a few seconds here. So we mark this as false. Sometimes when I go out in the field and talk to people about this part, someone will say, well, do you remember that news article about the young woman who encouraged her partner to end his life? And then he did go through with it. What I will say is that was a horrific, unique case. When we're saying talking about suicide won't cause someone to consider suicide, we're saying that we assume you're talking to them in a goal-oriented, compassionate, helpful way, right? So if you're talking to someone and asking them if they're suicidal and giving them that support, you're not going to put that thought in their head. Having thoughts of suicide is a really dark, lonely, hard place to be. If someone is not feeling that way, we can't just simply plant that thought in their head. So, of course, there are better and worse ways to talk to someone about suicide, but you're not just going to make someone who wasn't having thoughts of suicide all of a sudden start having those thoughts. Next statement, true, false, somewhere in between. People who are suicidal usually warn those around them. Okay. So we mark it as true. But it's true and it's false. What research shows us is that about 70% of the time, those who lose their life to suicide or attempt suicide have warned those around them. But that means 30% of the time, people really are left blindsided by the loss of their loved one. And I want to pay respect to that because that's about 1/3 of the time. 1/3 of the time, people really did not see this coming. But what happens a lot at Samaritans is when we talk to loss survivors and they tell us their family got together after the loss of their loved one and they were all really surprised. They just didn't see it coming. And then one person says, well, I noticed this small change in them, but it seemed really small. I honestly didn't think that much about it. And another person mentions, oh, yeah, I saw this other change, but same as you, it just seemed really small. I didn't think it was that big of a deal. And what happens is as they continue talking, they piece together this puzzle that paints a picture of someone who is really struggling. What I think we can do with this, with knowing that 70% of the time people do warn us, and 30% of the time we don't have any warning signs, is get to know the general warning signs that we'll talk about here and get to know what the unique warning signs are for those around you when they're struggling and being ready and able to start that conversation with them. An important thing to know, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, is that in that 70% of time that we do have warning signs, they're not usually verbal warning signs. So you're less likely to hear someone directly say to you, I'm having thoughts of suicide. It can happen, and it does, but you're more likely to see a lot more subtle signs. So that would be changes in a person's behavior or their physical appearance. And again, we'll delve a little bit more into that later. But the next statement, true, false, somewhere in between, it's a sign of weakness to ask someone for help if you're struggling. False. I think most of us would probably agree with this. It's really hard and difficult to reach out to someone when you're struggling. It can feel awkward, uncomfortable. It's very strange to start that conversation. So, honestly, it's a big source of strength, a sign of strength for someone to reach out and tell someone, I'm struggling. I need your support now. Last statement, true, false, somewhere in between. People who are depressed or suicidal are just seeking attention. The answer is false. It's a stigma that we're trying to break down in the field. I've also heard that maybe they are seeking attention. For example, a young person, maybe they're seeking attention, or maybe they don't have the right vocabulary to talk about what they're going through. But if they are seeking our attention, they're probably doing it for a good reason, right? Let's give them that attention and let's work through what they're going through. And if part of that is that they don't have the vocabulary to talk about what they're going through, let's work with them on that. Let's help them develop that. So people who are depressed or suicidal are not simply seeking attention, right? They're seeking your support because they're really struggling. What I hope the beginning of this webinar has started to show you and the larger context around the statistics that we talked about is that suicide and suicide prevention is pretty complex. As I mentioned before, it is not a black and white issue. I think many of us have read articles that have said something like, the boy was bullied, so he died by suicide, or a woman went through a divorce and took her life. And a lot of these articles make it seem like one thing caused those thoughts of suicide. But we can never blame a suicide on one isolated thing. It could be that an event was the straw that broke the camel's back, the precipitating event, the last thing that that person could really handle, but it's not necessarily the cause of their suicide. I like to remind people to think of a day when they were really struggling, having a hard time. Most likely on that day, you were experiencing multiple things, multiple stressful items. And it's the same for someone who's having thoughts of suicide. So we need to be careful about how we're talking about a suicide and what happened before that suicide. Another thing that we hear a lot at Samaritans from people who have had thoughts of suicide is that when they're feeling that way, it's not necessarily that they want to die, it's that they want the pain to end. And what we know about suicidal thoughts is that they tend to go in waves. So there are peaks where people are at their most hopeless, and then they tend to go down a little bit, and then they might go up in peaks. And what we know is if we can keep them safe during those peaks, those really tough, extremely hopeless, helpless moments, is that they can come down. We can help them through it. We can get them connected to resources and some support, and they can go on to lead very full, healthy, happy lives. The last thing I want to talk about before we get into risk factors and warning signs is I hope you've noticed that throughout the beginning of this webinar, I haven't said the phrase commit suicide. As much as possible, I try to say things like died by suicide or took their life, lost their life to suicide. When we hear the word commit, there's a lot of negative connotations with that. We think of things such as committed a crime, committed a sin, a murder, really heavy negative things. And when someone loses their life to suicide, it's one of the only, not the only, but one of the only ways that we judge the person after they died. So we would never say something like, that person committed cancer. So it might seem very small to change that language, and it's difficult. It's really ingrained in our society. But what we're trying to do is push ourselves to make that shift in our language and to give the people who have lost their lives to suicide a little more compassion. On the screen here, I have a list of risk factors. As you can imagine, this is of course not a comprehensive list. There are so many risk factors that are probably missing on this slide. For example, you might work with some clients that have similar risk factors that you're seeing all the time, and they're not shown here on the screen. Most of this comes from national information of common risk factors for those experiencing thoughts of suicide. But as I mentioned before, and as I will keep mentioning because I think it's important, we should be working with those around us, whether it's our clients or our loved ones, and recognizing what their own unique risk factors are and trying to put some protective measures in place for those. I want to talk about just a few of these risk factors a little more than just simply what's on the screen. If you have any questions about risk factors that I didn't delve as much into, I will put my contact information up at the end of this presentation, and you can feel free to reach out and we can discuss them more. The first bullet point that I want to talk a bit more about is that family history of suicide in the top left-hand corner. What we know is that someone who has a parent that holds a diagnosis such as depression or bipolar disorder is more likely than someone whose parents do not hold that diagnosis to have that diagnosis themselves. But it's not simply the genetic component that we're talking about here. It's also, how does your family talk about a loss by suicide? Is it crazy Uncle Bob died by suicide and he's kind of the black sheep of the family? Or is it, when Uncle Bob took his life, he must have been struggling a lot. I hope you know that if you ever feel that way, you can reach out and talk to me. So it's not necessarily that you're automatically doomed by genetics, right? There's a lot of things that we can work on within our family's culture to put in some protective factors to risk factors. Right next to it there, it says stressors that challenge traditional male roles. And I would really extend this to stressors that challenge any expected roles of us. The reason we have traditional male roles here is because of that statistic we talked about earlier, in that the largest group of reported suicides falls into men aged 45 to 64. But again, I think when every single one of us walks into a room of strangers who we're meeting for the very first time, people have an idea of who we're supposed to be. There are expectations daily of us, and when we can't live up to those, when we fall short, it can be extremely stressful. So fitting into a world where we're not gonna fill those roles that people think we are every single time. At the bottom there, we have a risk factor that says challenges that LGBTQ people face, particularly youth. I would also say any forms of oppression, racism, microaggressions, anything that is in your identity is not accepted within our society or tends to um, be targeted really does increase that risk factor for having thoughts of suicide. Warning signs here are changes that we're seeing in someone. So a shift in them that makes us think, I feel like they're going through something, they seem like they're struggling. I want to reach out and see how they're doing. We've divided those warning signs into 3 different categories: verbal, physical, and behavioral. I'm going to delve into each of those categories a little bit more, starting with verbal. And I want to start the verbal category by saying this is the least likely warning sign you will see and hear. We talked about it briefly before, but people are not very likely to say directly, I'm having thoughts of suicide. If there is a verbal warning sign, it tends to come in a more indirect statement. So something like, no one would miss me if I were gone. I want to go to bed and never wake up. Or very commonly, we hear jokes about suicide. I always urge young people when I'm giving them a presentation to remember that if their friend jokes about suicide, take it seriously. Check in with them. Say, I take that seriously. Are you having thoughts of suicide? And I like to remind adults too, because it can be uncomfortable to take those things seriously, right? Maybe they say something like, you're blowing this way out of proportion. I was just joking. But personally, I'd rather have the peace of mind. Either A, are they joking? Or B, was that their way of telling me? Because sometimes it's easier to say it in a joking manner rather than a very serious manner. The next category of warning signs is that physical category. And this is changes in anything physical that we can see. So changes in weight, hygiene, appearance, sleeping too much, sleeping too little, eating too much, eating too little. As humans, I believe we all live on a spectrum. Some days we sleep way too much, eat way too much. Other days we sleep too little, we don't eat a ton. So that's not to say that every time someone shifts it a little bit, we should be concerned about them. But really someone who's camping out on either end of that spectrum, or even like wildly tossing back and forth between the two, they might be struggling, right? Something's going on that I at least want to check in with them. The same thing holds true for things like hygiene or appearance. We all have different standards of what we want our hygiene and appearance to look like every day. And that's okay. It's noticing when someone has shifted from their own baseline. So if someone is a person who gets their nails done weekly, gets their hair done, really cares about fashion, and all of a sudden is showing up really disheveled and just doesn't seem to care anymore, that's the person that I want to check in with, right? So anytime you see a change in someone, a drastic change that makes you think, I think they're struggling, that's when we'd be reaching out and talking to them. The last category of warning signs is behavioral. These are the most subtle warning signs, the ones hardest to identify, and they're also the ones most likely that you will notice. Again, I want to delve a little bit further into a few of these. First, The one at the bottom left there says extreme mood swings, including a sudden mood lift after a down period. Often when I am giving presentations in person, I will ask the audience, how many of you have heard of this phenomenon? And many hands will go up. I then ask, what have you heard about it? Do you know why it occurs? And the most common response I get is people will say, I heard that when someone has finally decided on a plan of how to end their life, they start to see a light at the end of the tunnel. They're a little bit happier because they see the end to their pain. And this is true. This absolutely happens. But there's a few other things that could also be happening that are making this phenomenon occur. So the first is maybe the person is going to treatment, and maybe the treatment is going really well, right? I think we still want to check in with them, make sure they're doing okay. Maybe someone is going to treatment, and part of their treatment includes certain medications, such as antidepressants. What we know about antidepressants is that the first thing they do is they don't magically make your thoughts go away. They give you back your energy. And before a person starts taking antidepressants, it's possible that they are at their lowest energy level. And even though they're having thoughts of suicide, because they have such low energy, they can't bring themselves to go through with a plan. Once they start using that antidepressant and they've gotten some of that energy back, but are still having those thoughts, it's possible that they then have enough energy, enough motivation to go through with their plan. And this doesn't mean that antidepressants aren't a good thing for some people. It just means that there's a really critical moment when they're starting that medication that we want to be working with them to make sure that they're safe. The last thing that this phenomenon might mean, the one we hear a lot at Samaritans, is similar to the antidepressants. When a person who holds a bipolar diagnosis talks to us at Samaritans, often they tell us that during their manic episodes, so again, when they have all that energy, they're more concerned for their safety than when they're in the depressive modes. Again, because that energy just isn't there for them to go through with a plan. And it can feel really counterintuitive to reach out to someone who's been pretty low for a while and all of a sudden seems happy. But I also think that humans like to be noticed. I think it's okay to reach out to someone and say, I've noticed you seem like you're in a little bit better mood lately. How are you feeling? Let's talk a little bit more about that. The other behavioral warning signs, withdrawing from friends, family, or society. We see this one a lot. That one's really difficult because the more someone withdraws, the harder and harder it is to notice all those other warning signs. Underneath there, it says giving away prized possessions and putting one's affairs in order. A lot of people, I think, have heard this one as well. The one thing that I do want to say about this is that it's not always that the person fully realizes that they're doing this. They're not necessarily planning, I'm going to give this possession to this person, I'm going to say goodbye to this person. Sometimes it comes in the form of texts or messages to loved ones in their lives, just saying nice things that they don't necessarily even realize is them maybe saying their goodbyes. So it's a good reminder that as an outside onlooker, sometimes we have a more clear view of what someone is doing. Maybe we're more able to notice they're kind of putting their affairs in order than even they are. So again, checking in, supporting them. The last behavioral warning sign I like to talk a little bit more about is that reckless behavior one. Because every single one of us has a different personal definition of reckless behavior. So for example, sometimes people say reckless behavior is me not wearing my seatbelt. Other times, I've heard stories of young men who are affiliated with gangs. And because they're a gang member, anything they do that seems remotely reckless gets written off because people just see them as living this already pretty dangerous life. But one person in a presentation told me a story about a young man that he worked with that was in a gang, and all of a sudden kind of started ramping up that reckless behavior. So he was going into territory where he wasn't supposed to go. He was going out by himself without anyone else for that support. And again, most people would have written that off. They would have said, of course he's going to do that. He's in a gang. He's already reckless. But the person who told me this story recognized this is him ramping up. This is more reckless behavior than he's done before. So I cannot stress enough getting to know the baseline of people around you and seeing what the difference is, what the disparities are in their baseline, and noticing them, taking them seriously. I want to talk just briefly about how isolated events can add up. So as I mentioned before, we can never blame a suicide on one event. And most likely, we have more than one risk factor, right? So in this scenario, picture a 60-year-old woman, and she's had her share of stressors. So at age 30, she loses her mother. And that line there, that wavy line, that's water rising up. So the stress has created water up to her ankles of losing her mother, the grief that came with that. And then at age 35, she starts a high stress job. And while she enjoys it, there's a lot of stress that comes with it. There's a lot of hard things to navigate. And as you can see, the water continues to rise. At age 40, she gets a divorce and has lost that partner who was her support system, who helped her through that job and all the stress and the grief of losing her mother. At age 45, after working through all these different events, dealing with all of this stress and everything that's happening, she becomes diagnosed with depression. And again, you can see the water is rising. At age 50, on top of her diagnosis of depression, she then breaks a hip and has some physical health problems. It makes it harder for her to get around, to do the day-to-day things that she needs to get done. And at age 55, she becomes addicted to painkillers. And then maybe at age 60, with all these different things that she has went through in the course of her life, all these really heavy, stressful things, she then starts to have thoughts of suicide. So we can't just say, we can't look back at, oh, that addiction to painkillers, that's the reason she had thoughts of suicide, not any of these other hard things that she went through, right? It adds up. The more and more risk factors one has, the higher and higher their likelihood to have thoughts of suicide is. So it's a good reminder if you feel like you have a lot of risk factors or you feel someone in your life has a lot of risk factors, making it a practice to check in with each other and support each other. But before we go into the last section, before we talk about how can we have a conversation with someone who's having thoughts of suicide, what are things we should say, ask, what does it look like to get help? I want to take a moment and talk about resiliency and protective factors, because I feel like I go out into the field most days and I talk about a really heavy topic. We're talking about suicide for an hour, hour and a half. It's heavy. I like to remind people that as humans, we're also built to protect ourselves. And sometimes that part of us, the part that's built to protect ourselves, has been chipped away at a little bit. Sometimes it's harder for us to identify it. But we all have it. And we should be working with our clients, with our loved ones, to identify their protective factors and make sure they're in place for when they're having a crisis. What we know is that the more connected someone is, the better the outcome is. And connections can mean family, friends, but it can also mean a book for a teenager that just really makes them feel understood. That could be their connection as well. So identifying those protective factors with each other. So for the last part of this webinar, what I want to do, as I mentioned before, is talk about what a conversation might look like with someone who's having thoughts of suicide, what we can say and ask, and how we can help them. This is a pretty condensed version. This is what our Helpline volunteers go through for their training, except they do it in 30, 40 hours, and we're doing it in 20 minutes, 30 minutes. So it is very condensed. It is the basics, but I do think it creates a solid framework for you to begin to work off of. The very first thing you'll want to do if someone comes to you with some really heavy, difficult things is you simply want to listen to them. And that sounds really easy. You might think, I know how to do that. We all know how to do that. I like to challenge people to think about maybe the last few conversations they had with someone. And I think as you think about them, when we go through these listening do's and don'ts, you'll realize, oh, I do that one thing that I'm not supposed to do. Actually, I kind of do it a lot. Or I don't do that one thing that I'm supposed to do. Maybe I should try incorporating that more. We're all human. We all have areas where we could create some growth within ourselves. So I think it's a good idea as we go through these do's and don'ts of listening to identify where you have stronger skills and where you need to build those skills a little bit more. So first, the do's of listening. One of them, listening without judgment, I think seems on its face real easy. You can say, of course, I'm not going to judge anyone, right? But a lot of the times, our judgment pops up whether we want it to or not. So my colleague tells a story about when she was on the helpline. She was talking to a woman who was just very audibly upset, was going through some really difficult things, and was crying a lot. You could hear she was just very hopeless. It was a really hard call. And so my colleague had that conversation with the woman. When the conversation ended, she hung up the phone and the phone immediately rang. So she had to take a deep breath and think, okay, I'm going to brace myself for this next call. I'm ready for another really heavy, difficult conversation. So she picked up the phone, and when she started talking to the person on the other line, the man started telling a story about how he went to Subway and he asked for pickles on his sandwich, and they didn't give him pickles. And he was just so distraught. And she admits that at that moment, she was thinking, really? Like, pickles are your problem? I was just talking to this woman who's going through some really difficult stuff, and this man is worried about pickles? So what she did was took a moment, used some silence, which is perfectly okay, to kind of interrogate where her judgment was and also figure out how she could connect to this individual. And so she ended up saying something along the lines of, it can be really hard when we have an expectation and it's not met. And because she reserved that judgment and because she was compassionate in that moment, the man was able to open up a lot more. He talked about how it was his first day back to work after years of unemployment. He had just gotten back custody of a child, and the job was really important because of that, right? There were a lot of things that were going on, and unsurprisingly, it wasn't about the pickles. So every single one of us is going to have judgments. I think we've all been in conversations where someone tells us what they're struggling with at that moment, and sometimes we even think it's silly, like, you don't understand real life. That's your problem. So it's a good reminder to interrogate when we're feeling those things, notice it, and try to reserve some of it. Another important do is put away distractions. I know that some of you might have roles at work where you have to be talking to someone who's telling you some really difficult emotions, and also helping manage an emergency on the other side. If that's the case, I would be as honest as possible to the person who I'm talking to. So, for example, I would say something like, I have to keep my phone here. I might get a call. I'm waiting for a call about an emergency situation that we're working through. If I get a call from someone regarding that, I will have to pick up the phone. If I get a call or an email from anyone else, I'm not going to answer it. My attention is all yours. So just being honest. Having open body language, right? So not crossing my arms, for me, that's a really normal way for me to sit and stand. But sometimes I can tell someone I'm impatient, I'm over this conversation, I'm judging you, even if I don't mean it. So using open body language as much as possible. And also mimicking the body language of the person that I'm talking to. If they want to sit and have that conversation, if that's easier, I'm going to sit and have that conversation with them. If they'd rather stand, I'm going to stand and have that conversation with them. I'm going to use good eye contact if they're comfortable with it. If they're not as comfortable with eye contact, I could, if it's a young person, I could say, do you want to work on this puzzle while we talk? Give them something to concentrate on. I could say to someone, if it's appropriate, do you want to go on a walk? So there's distractions. Not all people are comfortable with eye contact. It's not acceptable in all cultures. So being aware of where that happens and who is comfortable, but if they are comfortable with it, I do think it's a good way to show that we're listening. Another good way to show that we're listening is paraphrasing what we hear. So reflecting back to them. What this does is, first, it tells them, I'm hearing those specific words that you're saying. I'm really listening to you. It also gives us the chance to clarify. You could say, I heard you say A. Did you mean B by this? And either they can say, yes, you're understanding that correctly, or they can say, no, that's not what I meant. Let me explain it again. So it also gives you that option to make sure that you're on the same page with them. And also validating people, right? They're struggling right now. They're having some really tough emotions, and validating them that it's okay to have those emotions. It's normal to have those emotions. Let's talk a little bit about the don'ts as well. The very first don't is don't talk about yourself or reflect on your own experiences. It's not about you, right? It's about them. Sometimes people will say, like, well, how am I supposed to connect with someone? But a lot of the times that's not what the person needs, right? They don't need you to connect with them. They don't need to hear about your stories. They need to have that space to talk. A really common response that people use when they're listening to someone tell them what they're going through, they'll say, I completely understand, or I get it. But that's not a good response for a few reasons. First of all, using that I statement, saying, like, I completely get it, I understand, you're starting to talk about yourself, right? You're starting to make the conversation about yourself. The second part is that most likely, if I'm listening to someone and I respond, I understand, most likely they're going to turn to me and say, but you don't completely understand, right? Like, even if we're having the same experience in that moment, we don't share all the other experiences in our life. We might not even be feeling the same about that scenario. So I think when people say, I completely understand, what they're hoping to convey is that that person's not alone, right? Other people have felt this way. It's normal that they're feeling this way. But I would tweak it a little bit, and I would say something more like, that's understandable that you're so stressed given this situation. I think a lot of people would be. So I'm not using an I statement. I'm not talking about myself. I'm not suggesting I get everything, because I probably don't. But I'm reminding them, I'm validating that it is normal, those feelings that they are having. The other bullet point underneath there says, don't give advice or try to solve their problems. At Samaritans, we try very hard not to give advice to solve anyone's problems. And when I explain why we do this, I like people to think of if they've ever been in a scenario where they're talking to someone, telling them a story about something hard in their life, and they get one sentence out, and the other person immediately jumps to advice. And in your head, you're thinking, I haven't even told you the whole scenario yet. I told you such a small piece. It's also possible that the person who has come to you with their heavy situation has already talked to multiple people about it. And it's possible that every person or a lot of people are giving them the same or pretty similar advice. And at that point, they're probably starting to get a little frustrated. They're getting this message that everyone thinks it's super easy. But if it were that easy, why are they struggling so much? And honestly, a lot of the times people don't want your advice. They need that space to really just talk it out and for you to just listen to them. So if I really did want to give my friend advice, if they came to me with their problem, what I would do first is I would sit on my advice way longer than I thought I should. I would just give them that space to talk. And then before I gave them that advice, I would ask a buffer question. And an example of a buffer question could be something like, I have a few friends who went through a similar situation. I know it helps them. I don't know if it'll help you, but do you want to hear that advice? And then that power is really in the hands of the person who's going through that hard time. Do they want that advice, or do they just need me to listen to them? And if someone tells me, I don't want your advice, I'm going to respect that. I'm going to let them just have that space. The bullet points beneath there that says, don't tell them what they're feeling is unimportant, wrong, will pass, it's just a phase. I don't think many of us say these things directly. I think this comes through a lot in our tone of voice. So just being very cognizant of what is my tone sounding like? Even if I don't mean to, am I suggesting I don't care about what they're talking about? Am I suggesting it'll pass? Lastly, a really important one, don't interrupt or change the topic. As humans, I think we have a tendency when people tell us something really difficult to try to paint a silver lining, to change the topic and try to make it more positive. At Samaritans, we have a phrase that we call steering into the pain, which means we're not going to change the topic. We are not going to try to paint a positive silver lining on it. We're going to sit there with that person while they're going through this really painful experience. We're going to sit there in that dark moment with them because at that moment in time, it's probably what they need. And most people probably aren't willing to sit in that dark spot with them. They're not willing to steer into that pain. It's pretty uncomfortable. You do have to train yourself to get used to sitting in that spot with them. But it can be really powerful to steer into the pain instead of changing the topic. So as we're listening to people in these conversations, we're probably going to be asking some questions, right? If we want the conversation to continue, we probably have to ask some questions. We are going to use questions that start with what and how, open-ended questions that the person can't just say yes or no to. And as much as possible, we're going to avoid questions that begin with why. When I think of why questions, my mind immediately goes to like a courtroom show where the lawyer is saying, why do you do this? Well, why do you do that? And it begins to feel like an interrogation. You might not mean to convey that if you ask a why question, but that doesn't mean that the connotation doesn't come with it. It can be kind of awkward, difficult to reword questions to avoid the why. It's of course not the end of the world. If you use a why question, you can bounce back from that, but trying to think of how you can ask important questions, avoiding why and using the words what and how instead. At Samaritans, we aim to use that 80-20 rule. What that 80-20 rule means is that 80% of the time, the caller is talking. and we're only talking 20% of the time. And in that 20% of the time that we're talking, we are avoiding advice, like we talked about earlier. We're asking those open-ended questions that begin with what and how. We're validating them. We're reflecting on making sure we're understanding what they're talking about. And we're giving them that space. This, of course, is the ideal, right? Sometimes we have people who talk 95% of the time and we only talk 5% of the time. That's perfectly okay too, right? If they need that space, we're happy to give it to them. Other times, I'm sure some of you have had the experience if you work with clients, for example, where the client talks 10% of the time. And it's like pulling teeth. You have to talk 90% of the time to get them to open up. So as I mentioned, this is the ideal place that you want to reach, but it's not going to happen in every conversation. The bottom line is you want to give them more space to talk than you are. Two of the bullet points on this screen that are very important to me personally, and I think incredibly powerful, are letting the answers come from the person and acknowledging their pain by using their words. So for example, if someone tells me this event that I went through, it was so traumatic, I'm not going to say, that sounds kind of scary, right? They said it was traumatic. They didn't say it was scary. And that might seem nitpicky, it might seem very small, but by using different words, sometimes we can minimize what that person's going through. And if it's a big, heavy experience that they just had, and they're starting to be able to define what happened to them, it can be really powerful if we acknowledge the words that they're using and use the same words to define their experience. At the end of the day, like I said, don't worry too much about finding the perfect words. We're all going to have conversations with someone where we get a sentence out and we immediately wish we could take it back. Maybe we notice that didn't sound like what I meant it to seem like, or we see a reaction from them, right? Like they didn't take it the way I intended it. It's going to happen. So don't sit there and worry too much about the perfect words. I think being compassionate and sincere can take you a long way. All of these guidelines that we're giving you are important to start thinking about and to start incorporating and trying to consciously use, but we're all going to make mistakes. So giving yourself a little bit of grace in that moment as well. Then as the conversation continues, we're going to get to a point where we're going to ask someone directly about suicide. So I have 3 examples here on the screen. Do you sometimes feel so bad that you think about suicide? Have you been having thoughts of suicide? Are you feeling suicidal? You'll notice that every single one of those questions I have up there has the word suicide. Sometimes people ask me, can I ask this question without using the word suicide? That feels really harsh. What I will say to that is, I think there are a few ways you can ask it without saying suicide. You could say, have you ever had thoughts of ending your life? But I also think people try to avoid the word suicide so much that a lot of the times they end up asking questions that are not really getting to the point of suicide. An example of a question like that would be, are you thinking of harming yourself? Maybe that's an important question to have in that conversation with that person, but it doesn't necessarily answer the question of if they're feeling suicidal. Someone could be intending to harm themselves and not end their life. In the field, we call that non-suicidal self-harm. So I think it's important to get comfortable with asking someone directly about suicide, and then make sure you know what to do afterwards. I'm going to delve a little bit into what we do at Samaritans after we ask someone, are they having thoughts of suicide? And I want to preface it with saying that your work may have certain policies and procedures. Maybe you have a risk assessment that looks different than this one. If that's the case, of course, follow the protocol and policy of your workplace. I think what this can do is supplement it a little bit, or you could use it in your own personal life. So on the Samaritans Helpline, everyone gets risk assessed, and we ask everyone, are you having thoughts of suicide? If the person says no, the first thing we want to do is we want to make sure that we're not showing any relief. We might be feeling it. Maybe we're pretty relieved that they're not having those thoughts of suicide, but we don't want to convey that to them for multiple reasons. One being, that person could be lying to us. Maybe they're not comfortable enough to tell us, yeah, I am having those thoughts of suicide. And if we express relief at that time, what we're telling them is, we were in no way equipped to handle this. Or maybe they are telling us the truth, but maybe a year from now, 2 years from now, they are having thoughts of suicide. And they remember that conversation with us and again think, well, Kelsey wasn't ready to deal with that. I can't go to her. So kind of reserving some of that relief and debriefing with teammates, supervisors afterwards. If the person says, yes, I am having thoughts of suicide, we start to continue down the line with our risk assessment, which is these questions here that are italicized. Our next question we ask is, have you thought about how you might take your life if you were to? What we're doing with that is assessing, does someone have a plan? Have they really thought this through? And as much as possible, we tack on that if you were to phrase. And the reason we're saying if you were to is to remind people that they don't have to go through with this. It might feel like that at the moment, but there are other options. So it's a subtle way to remind them that. If the person tells us, yes, I do have a plan, we continue down this risk assessment. We say, have you thought about what you may use your life to take your life if you were to? So at that point, we're assessing the means. Again, have they thought about what they will use? If someone replies, yeah, I have, I'm going to use a bottle of pills and a glass of wine. The next question we're going to ask, we're going to assess where they are in relation to those means. So we say, where are you in relation to those means? The reason we're doing this is because what we know in the field is that, as I mentioned before, suicidal thoughts go in waves. There's those peak hopelessness, feelings of hopelessness, where that person has the most energy and is feeling at their lowest and is most able to go through with their plan. And if they have those means there, it puts them at higher risk. If they're separated from those means at that time, and we can work through it with them, we can give them that support, and we can get them lower down, not as high in that peak, they tend to be safer once they get back to those means because they're at a lower point in the wave of thoughts of suicide. So in this example, I would ask someone, where are you in relation to the bottle of pills? And where are you in relation to the glass of wine, right? Because they have two means that they're planning to use. If a person says, I'm holding the bottle of pills and the wine glass is next to me, what we're going to do is we're going to ask them if they're willing to separate themselves from that means. We might say, are you willing to put that bottle of pills down and move into the other room? Again, the reason we're doing that is because we know that it's critical to create that space between that person and the means when they're at that highest peak of helplessness. If a caller tells us, I'm not comfortable doing that, we of course will keep talking to them. It's just a safety measure that we're trying to put in place. And then the very last question that we ask is, if you were to take your life, have you thought about when you may do so? And at Samaritans, what we consider highest risk is within 24 hours. And that's when we would start working with the team to figure out, how are we putting safety measures in place? What are we doing to support this caller at this time? If the person has a definite plan, their means are available, they have a time set, it's immediate, consider that person at very high risk. And if someone's at that high of risk, it's too big of a risk to keep to yourself. So making sure that you're incorporating teammates, supervisors, getting that support, because more heads in this scenario are better than one. It's going to take more than one person to keep that individual safe. As I mentioned before, again, our protocol might look different than the protocol in your workplace. If that's the case, follow your workplace protocol. If someone is coming to you and they're at high risk in that risk assessment, you can do a few things. You can call their doctor if they have a good relationship with their therapist. They might already have things in place to keep that person safe. So you'd be working with them as a team. If it's clearly an emergency, if that person's life is truly in danger, first, you want to make sure you're not leaving them alone. So even if it might not seem like it, at that moment in time, if you're with that person, they're relatively safe. They're less likely to go through with their plan while you're there. You're also not on a ticking time clock, right? The time is not ticking down. You don't have to race ahead of it. They're pretty safe when they're with you. So stay with them. If you need to call in extra support, if you need to call a teammate, do that while you're with that person. Right? Don't leave them to make that conversation, that call. You can also call 911 and local emergency services. You can say, I have someone who is having thoughts of suicide. I need a wellness check. And they'll come and do that wellness check. You can also call and text us, again, at our helpline, which I will, again, post at the end. You can call or text us. You can call with the person if you want to. You can encourage them to call. You can call yourself and figure out what you need to do to support them. But just really don't forget to reach out to your own support systems. It's a really heavy thing if someone comes to you with thoughts of suicide. It's difficult to process. You're not supposed to carry that weight of the world on your shoulders. Reach out and get your own support as well. Another thing that you might want to consider doing with your clients, if you don't already, or with your loved ones, is safety planning. So safety planning is figuring out what coping strategies the person has and what they can do to make themselves safer in a time of crisis. You want to do this safety planning with someone, not when they're at that peak of crisis, ideally when they're lower, when they're healthier, happier, and they can think a bit more clearly. If you do safety planning already, you probably have your own template of how you do that. If you don't, that URL at the bottom there in tiny letters is a template for safety planning. So it's figuring out what that person's unique warning signs are. How do they usually convey to others that they're struggling? What are their coping strategies? Who are their support system? Who are people? What are resources they can reach out to? And what's a safer environment that they can be in? So is it better for them to be around a bunch of people if they're feeling that way? Is it better to be with a few close friends? And lastly, the last one says reminders of hope and reasons to live. And I will say use this at your best judgment. This tends to work a little bit better with young people versus the aging population. So it can backfire. You could explain to someone, here are some reasons for you to live, reminders of hope, and it could backfire. They could really feel like, no, there are no reasons to live. I don't have any reminders of hope. So I like to tell people, you know the individuals that you're working with, of course, better than I do. So taking it at your best judgment of whether that last piece of the safety planning is more helpful or more harmful. I just want to leave you all with a few thoughts, final thoughts, before I give you a few resources. First of all, I want to remind you all again, give yourself permission to be human. The same thing that I said earlier, that one isolated event doesn't cause a suicide, holds true that one person can't stop a suicide. You don't have to be the expert. You don't have to have all the answers. You're not going to have all the answers. So incorporating, again, your teammates, your supervisors, calling us, creating a community of support to not only support you, but to support this individual as well. It's also, as I mentioned before, incredibly important to stay calm. So if you're talking to someone who's telling you they're having thoughts of suicide, and on a scale of 1 to 10, you're creeping up to 10, where you're like the least calm, you're stressing out, and this person started at a 6, they're going to notice that you're creeping up. And pretty soon they're going to creep up to the 10 themselves. So it's a hard, heavy thing to deal with. You're not going to be immediately naturally calm, but practicing and reminding yourself to take that moment to calm yourself so you can help that person as calmly and clearly as possible. And make sure you're debriefing with someone afterwards. So even though you're maybe really calm in that moment, you're going to have to process a lot of things. It's a difficult, heavy thing to hold on to. So debriefing with the supervisor after and practicing some self-care as well. What I have on the screen here is 4 different resources, and I'll touch a little bit more on each of them to explain them a little bit further. At the top there, again, that's a number for our helpline. We're available 24/7. You can text it, you can call that number. Underneath there, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. It's important to give out this number if you have a client or a loved one who speaks another language besides English. At this moment in time, our helpline is only available to English speakers. So if you have someone who speaks a different language, give them the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline number. What will happen is it will be routed through to us, but it'll also be routed through with translation services. So we'll be able to have that conversation with them and it will be translated. Underneath there is the Boston Emergency Services team, or the BEST team. If you're not in the Boston area, it's quite possible that your area has a similar team. So do some research yourself and try to look into emergency services teams run by master's levels clinicians and physicians. So the BEST team is those master levels clinicians and physicians, and they specialize specifically in psychiatric crises. So if you have a client who you know it's not appropriate to call emergency services on them for whatever reason, maybe they've had their own bad experience with that, you can call the BEST team instead, and they'll send out that clinician, that physician who specializes in psychiatric crises to do that wellness check. The last resource, Emergency Services Program Mobile Crisis Intervention, that 1877 number. That number there, you can call and you will enter your zip code and get routed through to your emergency services provider. And the reason to potentially use this is because when you call 911, what happens is they send the first available vehicle. So sometimes that's an ambulance, sometimes that's a fire truck. You get whatever is closest. If you call this 1877 number, you can ask for certain accommodations. So for example, if you have a client that you know has some trauma that will be set off with flashing lights, you can ask on this number, can you send an ambulance with the lights off? You can make accommodations that'll keep your client the safest at that moment. But before I put up our helpline number one more time, as well as my own personal information, I just want to remind you all to take care of yourself, right? I just talked to you for an hour and a half about suicide prevention, and we're all dealing with heavy things every day in our life. So making sure that you're carving out that time every day to take care of yourself as well. So one last time, here is that Samaritans helpline. Call or text that number on the screen, 24/7. It's a free service, it's confidential, it's anonymous. It's a way to talk about anything that is, at this moment, difficult in your life. If you have any questions about what we talked about here, if you would like to book an in-person training or a webinar for your own organization, you can call or text me. That number below is my specific business line, but I would encourage you to actually email me instead because I'm usually out in the field. I'm going to schools and organizations, driving around. I don't have access to that business line as quickly as I do have access to my email. So I can respond to you much quicker if you email me instead of if you call me. And also, that is the website for Samaritans. Follow us on social media. We'll talk to you, we'll tell you about different events that are coming up. We post different coping skills that you can use with individuals. It's a good resource to help those around you and yourself as well. But lastly, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for spending the time with us today, to listening to me talk about suicide prevention for quite a bit, and starting to work on those skills to help those around you. Thank you.